Greetings. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Gloria Bashir, and on behalf of Masjid al-Taqwa and our resident Imam, Imam Tariq Al-Amin, as well as the Taleem committee that includes myself, Dr. Lionel Allen, and chaired by Dr. Aisha Al-Amin, I greet you with the greetings of peace. Again, Assalamu alaikum. We're going to first welcome you and open our today's Taleem with Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with Allah's name, the merciful benefactor, merciful redeemer. Praise be to Allah, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer, master of the day of judgment. Thee do we worship, and thine aid we seek. Show us the straight way, the way of those on whom thou hast bestowed thy grace, and those whose portion is not wrath, and who go not. Ameen. Again, welcome, welcome, welcome. So today, we have the pleasure of having our Taleem presentation by one of our dear brothers, Brother Bill Chambers. And I'm so looking forward to his presentation today. Just as a side comment to kind of tie in our presentation, this month of June is Health Awareness Month. And as I take personal liberty in how I define health, that includes economic health, social justice and community health, as well as mental health. And that really brings us to today's topic presented by Brother Bill. And I'm really excited about this. We have a dynamic presentation today, and this will be a two-part series, today and next Sunday's Taleem as well, in an effort to really do a deep dive into this topic. So our dear Brother Bill, he will discuss his journey to Al-Islam and his new book, The Muslim American Fight for Social Justice, From Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter. And just so that our audience knows, here is a copy of Brother Bill's book. And he also put information in the chat on how to get a copy of his book. Okay, so first let me do a brief just bio of Brother Bill. Bill Chambers is a member of Masjid al-Taqwa Chicago and a member of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. He is a full-time activist with a long history of civil rights, anti-racism, anti-war, Irish Republican, and Palestinian solidarity work. As part of his activism work, Bill has traveled extensively to Ireland and Palestine to meet and work with community organizations. He has published multiple articles for the Muslim Journal, Muslim Matters, Electronic Intifada, Palestine in America, and the Chicago Monitor on Islamophobia. Surveillance of Muslims and social justice groups, Palestine solidarity campaigns, Black Lives Matter, and the movement for community control of the police. He is a retired student support services coordinator and counselor at the American Islamic College and former editor-in-chief of the Chicago Monitor. Bill has a BA in English from Northwestern University, an MA in English from Tufts University, an MA in Islamic Studies from the American Islamic College in Chicago, and professional certification in family therapy from the Family Institute of Chicago. Bill grew up in Detroit and now lives in the Chicago area with his wife, Elaine Fleming. So I have the greatest pleasure to introduce to you Brother Bill Chambers. So Brother Bill, take it away.
Thanks very much, Dr. Gloria. One of the things I'd like to start this conversation, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions and we can make it more of a conversation, is with a hadith from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. This is from Bukhari. For every day on which the sun rises, there is a reward from God for those who establish justice among the people. So you'll be hearing, obviously, a lot about social justice, in my belief, is the core of Islam, and is also the core of the book that I wrote. So what I'm going to do for this session, on this first part, and I thank again Dr. Gloria and the Taleem Committee for allowing me to take up 2 sessions to talk about my book. For this time, I'm going to go through 2 of the main conclusions that I came to in doing the research and study for this particular book. And then how this came together, what kind of research I did. And then also, as she said, really start with, how did I end up being part of the Imam W.D. Muhammad community, or my beloved community, that I would call it. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some major themes that go through my book. And then next time, we're going to talk a lot more about the social justice history of the Nation of Islam, and the Imam W.D. Muhammad community, and all the groups that came after them, like Iman, many of you know, Inner Study Muslim Action Network, Muslims of Ferguson, Muslims for Social Justice, and the Muslim ARC, or the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, that I'm a part of. So that's the plan. So what we're going to do today is, let me start with 2 of the conclusions. And these are things that I would like you to keep in your head, because they're probably the most important takeaways from the book. The first one is that the Nation of Islam and the Imam W.D. Muhammad community of Al-Islam, the true history of those groups has been distorted and what I would call redacted, which means some of the either very important parts of that history have been eliminated, or parts of that history that don't fit with the dominant American narrative. And you're going to hear a lot more about that, and why I seem to think that. And one of the things that's going to come up is kind of one of the major focus, and this will come up a lot next time, is that the Nation of Islam was not a religion. Keep hearing that over and over and over again. What it really was a Black nationalist group. And I always found that very odd, because, well, that's what J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI thought it was. And if you read all of their horrendous investigations, the surveillance of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and everybody else that came after him, they had the Nation of Islam on the list of Black nationalist groups. So as far as they were concerned, that's not a religion. Well, the thing that's disturbing, and I'll get to this in a moment, is a lot of the history, and the academic history particularly, or the popular culture history, seems to agree with J. Edgar Hoover. That, well, Nation of Islam, they're, not really a religion, they're all about Black nationalists, and okay, not true. So the other major conclusion that I came in writing this book is that the Nation of Islam and the Imam W. Muhammad community served as models for all the Muslim American groups that came after them. And a lot of the groups, they still were dominated by people of color, but these Muslim American groups, their main focus was to fight social justice. And there are all those groups, Aman and so on, that I talked about earlier. So as you go through the book, again, keep those 2 things in mind. And I want to talk about the book, the kind of genesis of it, how did this come about? There's part of the book that we'll talk more about next week, that I do a review of a number of popular films. And I found that very helpful to get an idea of what the popular culture view was of Muslim Americans, and particularly African-American Muslims. So that came out of a paper I did for Dr. Aldine in the class that I took from her on a long time ago that I'll be talking about later. Some of the book came from my master's thesis in Islamic Studies at the American Islamic College, and it was going to be my dissertation. I got accepted at the PhD program at the Chicago Theological Seminary, but unfortunately, the beginning of my start there in my research was exactly when COVID hit. And any of you know, and I'm sure Dr. Gloria knows this, you can't do a PhD remote, and you can't do so anyway. So I eventually figured, okay, I can't make a dissertation out of it. I'm just going to publish the book. And I did a lot of updates and various things. So the material and the research I did was I really reviewed every single academic book that was written about the Nation of Islam. And there's a lot of them. And, what I ended up finding out is that they were all prejudiced in some way, or had some like Christian perspective, or surprisingly, and I'll get to this a little bit later, their analysis seemed to agree, like I said, with the FBI that, well, Nation of Islam, yeah, they're a black nationalist group. Okay. And particularly, they did talk about the Imam W. Muhammad, but how they would talk about him was, well, he was the religious leader and the son of Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and he transitioned all these people in the Nation of Islam, and he brought them all over to traditional Sunni Islam. And that's about what they would say. Well, anybody here in this community knows what he did was much more important than that. And he was an extremely significant religious leader. Well, you don't find that information anywhere in these books. And that's just, they kind of treat him like it's an after fact. The only good books I read, and I think some of you probably know some of these books. One was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the man behind the men. That was Mikhail Sahir's book. And then Our Family's Evolution from Nationalism to Al-Islam. That was Abdul Karim Hassan's book. Both books are terrific. I mean, and obviously they were written by people who were part of the Nation of Islam and part of the Imam Muhammad community and so on. But the issue is, do you think any of those books are on academic reading lists? And both of those books were pretty much self-published in one way or another. So, you can find them on Amazon, but that's about the only place you can find them. So I really kind of came to this conclusion, no, there really isn't anything good that's been written out there and comprehensive and accurate on this topic. The other thing I did is what we would call like primary sources study. So every book that Honorable Elijah Muhammad ever wrote, Minister Farrakhan ever wrote, all the books of collections of the Imam W. Muhammad's khutbahs, his speeches, there's a lot of those out there. I've read all of those. I think the only one, there's a new one that's about Moses and the parting of the sea or something. I haven't read that one yet, but I've read all the other ones. I did a lot of looking at speeches, videos, and so on. And I also did a number of interviews. So I did interview some people in the Nation of Islam from our community, W. Muhammad community. And the groups that I'll be talking about next time, the social justice groups, I interviewed, I think, just about all of the founders of those various groups. So you really get a feel of like, how did Muslims for Ferguson's get started? Because that's really fascinating. So I did those kind of interviews, and then there's another book that some of you may know. It's by Dawn Marie Gibson and Jamila Karim. This was back in 2014. It's called Women in the Nation Between Black Protest and Sunni Islam. They did an amazing job of interviewing women, both in the Nation of Islam and then mainly who continued on to Minister Farrakhan's Nation of Islam. A lot of source of a lot of wonderful interviews. And I've used a lot of that material in my book also. The one thing I want to say, though, is that I want to be very clear. This is, in doing the interviews and the research I did, I didn't do a representative sample of interviews, okay? So this is not a sociological study. It's not a religious history. What it is an analysis of the development of social justice groups within the Muslim American community. So this is a history book. And it has that focus because that story really hasn't been told, or when it has been, it's been distorted. Okay. So now I want to just turn to one of the main things we talked about, said I was going to talk about is, you know, my journey to al-Islam. One of the first major parts of that, and I want to talk about, again, as you probably notice, I like to talk about themes of things. And this is kind of a theme. These themes run through how I got here. And they also, not so surprisingly, run through my book. So the two things to kind of keep in mind when you listen to this story is, number one, the centralization or centrality of racism in American society. I'm someone that's always believed for a very long time, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute, that the central contradiction in American society is racism. And that drives a lot of institutions and laws and so on, and that's still going on. The other part is this whole redaction of history. And you know, you see a lot of that now. People are starting to talk about that. Oh, you know, there was the Tulsa massacre, like, you know, what was that? You know, I mean, they're constantly recovering history that, well, let's face it, the dominant white community, white Christian community, did not want anybody to know about. So in all the various activism that I've been involved in, whether it's been anti-racism or working with the Black community, being an Irish activist, being a Palestinian activist, all of that activism had pieces of its history just distorted and eliminated. And I know I've talked to some of you, particularly I think Brother Bashir. Well, I didn't know who Imam W. Muhammad was until I took Dr. Aldean's course in, you know, graduate school at the American Islamic College. And I think now that, you know, that's pretty pathetic. Well, then I find out that he's not taught anywhere. You don't, I mean, he's this incredibly important religious figure that if you ask the average person, they don't know who he is. Well, that was done for a reason. And that's kind of partly what I want to get to. So the earliest part of my activism, and I talked about this one other time when I did a Taleem presentation, was with a group called People Against Racism, or PAR. And this was 1968, 69. And they were a group whose central belief was that racism was a central contradiction in American society, and that the job of white people was to organize against racism in their own community. And if you remember, this was a time when Black Power was starting to become more of a controlling, you know, theme or factor. In this particular group, there was a national student group that was mainly anti-racism, kind of at the tail end of the civil rights movement in Detroit. And they split up into one group that became, I would say, more like SNCC, maybe a little bit more radical than SNCC, but the other group was the one that turned into PAR, and they were all white people, and their idea, which I still agree with, was this kind of organizing the white community, but also only being allies to the Black community when they wanted us to, or on their terms, or whatever. So PAR certainly thought that the Vietnam War, for example, was a racist war, war against yellow people. It reminded me of Muhammad Ali's, there's no Viet Cong ever called me, whatever. So that was their kind of belief. And this group, it was somewhat of a leftist group, but it wasn't a faith group. There's no connection to any religion. It wasn't a socialist group, so it didn't have any political ideology. Well, when I look at that now, I think that's one of the reasons this group has just disappeared from history. I mean, it was a big group. I mean, it was a national organization. They had big chapters in Detroit, Chicago, University of Michigan, and some other places. Well, PAR did not fit with the narrative. And in this case, the narrative is, well, if you're a white person, you might be a freedom rider, you might support Martin Luther King and doing civil rights work, but like a white group that thinks, the white community is racist and that's a central contradiction, and our job is to work in the white community. Nobody wanted to hear that. And if you look at how PAR was treated in history, that's the same argument that I'm going to use for Muslim Americans, particularly the Nation of Islam, and particularly the Imam David Ahmed community. That, and kind of transition to this, there's a book it's Islam in America. It's like a history book. And it's by Ghani Basiri. And in the book, he describes this American civic religion. The American civic religion is mainly white, Christian, and people that are dedicated to American democratic values, like whatever those happen to be, and they usually aren't defined. So to be a legitimate American, you got to be white, you got to be Christian, and you got to, believe in these democratic values. Well, that lets out a lot of people like us. So
Brother Bill,
go ahead. Yeah.
Let me just chime in just for a minute. So given your work with PAR, and you said that dates back to when?
1968, 69. Okay.
Your work with PAR and your other activism work. So what really spurred you? I mean, as a young person, what spurred you to really have this activism spirit? What began that journey?
Probably the easiest way to explain that, I was brought up as a Catholic, and I went to a Jesuit high school, and the Jesuits, one of the good things they had going for them is they were always questioning, very much into social justice and intellectually questioning. And particularly, I was very much against the war in Vietnam, and against, the racism I saw in American society. And that, that violated a lot of Catholic beliefs I had. So some of those beliefs came from being a good Catholic. But eventually, I think when I was a senior or whatever, I took this class that was all about social activism or social responsibility. And then they had this whole chapter in the class that was about the Vietnam War. Well, the whole chapter talked about how the Vietnam War was a justified war, because the Catholic Church has this whole thing about, well, it's a justified war if this and this and happen. Of course, I'm reading this going, this is total BS. I mean, this isn't right at all. So I've always been, I guess it has something to do with being brought up in Detroit and my parents and all that. It's like, I just believe that you treated everybody equally. And so when I didn't see that happening, well, that's the problem. And I don't know, I would try to look for something to do about it. Let's put it that way. Does that help a little bit?
That did. Because you've covered a lot of ground. As you started, you were talking about a lot of the history of this community being redacted, and not just this community, but other
absolutely
other
communities. That's right.
And I was going through your book, and there was one documentary, and if you get a chance to talk on it, maybe you can. And that is, it was a documentary titled "The Hate That Hate Produced." Oh
yeah, I'll probably talk about that next week.
Okay, all right.
That's okay.
And that's fine. And the other big question is the fact that the PAR in particular had this idea that the central theme or the central contradiction in American society is really racism. In spite of all of our different religious values, right? And as you said, you were raised to be a good Catholic before converting to Al-Islam many moons ago. I was a Baptist in the Christian faith, and just as many other folks who are online before we made our conversion, right? But the thought that the central contradiction really is racism that nobody wants to talk about.
That's right. People didn't want to talk about it back then either. I mean, I was involved like peripherally with like socialist groups or Marxist groups, and and I would always listen to their rhetoric and that kind of thing. And there's something to be said. I mean, I'm kind of a socialist myself, but they would come, the central contradiction is really class. It's like, and I'm looking around me and going, and then they would go off, they had these like middle-class white kids that decided that they were going to become factory workers and, hang out in the factory and be part of the working class. And I just thought, okay, you guys are, that's ridiculous, because if you're in part of the working class, even in Detroit, I mean, the automakers did everything they possibly could to split the black members of the union from the white members of the union. And, if they could keep those sides apart, that was great. Well, if you have a class analysis, that's not gonna help your analysis of what's wrong with America.
Yes,
class is involved. That's a factor, but not as important as racism is.
Yeah. Well, I will let you continue to talk about your family. I just wanted to.
That was a good interjection. That was the word I was looking for. So the only other things that I was going to mention in this kind of journey to Islam is, as you also heard, I was a Irish Republican activist, which just means that somebody who believes that the North and South of Ireland should be reunited, and believes that the North of Ireland is under British occupation by either British troops or police forces or whatever. And the time I was involved, there was Bernadette Devlin was a figure who started the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement Association. And it was based totally on the America's Civil Rights Movement, because that's where nationalists, people who were pro-Irish, Catholics, but there were Protestants who were pro-Irish too, they were treated horribly. I mean, if you talk about, it was almost on the level of Jim Crow, where, people couldn't get jobs, they couldn't get an education, they were randomly attacked by these racist, sectarian groups all the time, all that kind of stuff. Well, that became a lot of also a manipulation of history where, I took many, many trips to Ireland, and I'd be sitting here and reading the paper and about something that I was involved in. And I'd read this and go, wait a minute, this isn't what happened. And then, of course, I figured out that the US newspapers got all their information from the British. So the British were telling their side of the story. And even they're also being a part of that activism at the time. There's this whole idea of, what it means to be white in America. And I think most of you know, it really doesn't have anything to do with your skin color. Like Irish Americans are a good example. When they first came to America, they were treated, oh, they're monkeys, they follow the Pope, they're disgusting, they're all drunkards or whatever. But, once they got a larger group and joined the police force, particularly, or became politicians, well, suddenly they were white. Well, they were white all the way along, but, they weren't treated as if they were. And the country has a long history of deciding, like they brought in Christian immigrants to work on the transatlantic railroad. Said, oh, we need some workers, actually slave labor, but we need some workers. So we'll consider them white. And then once they were done with, the railroad, their work, they're not really white anymore. They're those yellow people that we're gonna deport. And that's literally what the United States did. They just deported them all back. So this idea of, do you fit into this, really racist idea that you really need to be white and Christian to really be a true American? I mean, we still hear that kind of thing now. All through my activism, that kept coming up over and over again. And then the last part is like, when I was a Palestinian activist, that I still am, talk about manipulation of history. It's the strong Israeli settlers who came to a land without a people and made it green, and except there were all kinds of Palestinians living there. And so there's that kind of history. And of course, we all know all Palestinians are terrorists. So and that's still happening now. So there's this dual thing of, of white society, and this is a function of racism, deciding what kind of history they're going to tell and what kind they don't, because they're threatened by it. And also defining, of course, who's going to be white or not. And if you're not white, you're demonized by whatever not white means. You're Palestinian, you're an Irish terrorist in the north of Ireland, or whatever it may be. Now, coming a little bit more closely to, well, how did I become a Muslim after all this? So all these things were preparations for that. In my trips to Palestine, I spent a lot of time walking in the old city of Jerusalem. And anybody who's ever been there, it's just one of the most overwhelming spiritual experiences. What I would imagine, I've been on Hajj, but that must be what that's like. And I just found that very inspiring. On one of my trips, my son and I stayed with a Muslim family in Nablus, which is a kind of center of Palestinian resistance, and just had these conversations about Islam and answered all their questions and so on. And then really after that, I did a lot of reading of the Quran, commentaries on the Quran. But I have to say, probably the most important thing that affected me was reading the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. I read practically everything I could about his history. And I was always so impressed by, here's this person that was an amazing religious leader, but also he was a political leader. And at one time, he probably created the most moral city in history, where everybody would get along and people followed, these principles and were dedicated to Allah. And I was just always so impressed by them. Well, and I still am. And then when I went to American Islamic College, and the only reason I went there to begin with was Taleem, or Taleef Collective had some new classes for new converts. And I don't like the word convert, but that's the one they use. But they taught me how to pray and how to go into a mosque and that type of thing. And so when I was there, I was like, oh, okay, this is like a 4-year undergraduate, graduate Islamic college, and a lot of different kinds of people here. And I said, okay, I'm gonna stay here. So that's where I got my master's degree. But a lot of being there, it was also, I had 2 of my best professors were part of the Imam W.D. Muhammad community. I was blessed enough to have a course from Dr. Deborah Majid on Islam and gender studies, and then Dr. Amin Al-Din's course on the African-American experience in Islam. 2 of the best professors I've ever had anywhere. But it also helped that I met 2 amazing people, Imam Tariq, and particularly Imam Rabbani, who was there during my whole time there. And, you know, we had all kinds of discussions, and they were in classes with me and everything else. Very impressed by, you know, who they were and how they practiced Islam and so on. So I think the being in Dr. Al-Din's class, she went through that whole history, you know, that 25 to 30% of slaves were from very advanced West Africa.
So what about
amazing? I'm sorry?
I can't hear you.
Mute yourself.
I think I put in the closet.
Can you mute yourself?
Oh, I thought you were saying she couldn't hear me.
No, not
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the fact that many of the original slaves were Muslim, and they were forced to convert to Christianity. And I'll talk about roots next time. That's a whole fascinating thing. But you know, she taught me that whole history of, you know, the Moorish Science Temple, Ahmadiyya movement, the Nation of Islam, and of course, Imam W.D. Muhammad. And I also started reading a lot of books by Imam W.D. Muhammad, you know, the collections of khutbahs. And one of the conclusions I drew, and I'm going to talk about this a fair amount, maybe not today, but it gave me the impression when I read a lot of the books or a lot of the khutbahs or speeches of the Imam that, you know, this was a version of Islam that was solidly within the American democratic culture. You know, that this was you know, for lack of a better word, I mean, this wasn't a Muslim American version of Islam. And I talk about later in my book that, I mean, I think we all know that wherever Islam took hold in any part of the world, well, we all follow the 5 pillars of Islam, but we all express that and do that as part of our culture, right? And as part of the historical period that we are living in. And that's what it seemed to me that the Nation of Islam was doing. And that's what it seemed to me that Imam W. Muhammad was doing. But it was also his emphasis on the mind, very, very approachable and reasonable understanding of the Quran, emphasis on, you know, being part of the public life, promoting interfaith dialogue. I was like, I agree with all these things. And, you know, I'd spent a lot of time going to other mosques and didn't feel part of it and everything. And finally decided, well, you know, if I like Imam Rabbani so much, I probably should go check out where he's an Imam. And then obviously, you know, my experience kind of went on from there. So that's been a wonderful period of time. I think I'm going to leave some time for questions. One of the couple things I just want to go through, and this is probably a little bit preparation for a lot of what we're going to talk about next week. But these are some of the assumptions that I made as I went through my book. The one thing, you know, we've already talked about, that Islam is this major Racism is a major focus in how Muslim Americans are treated and just in Muslim American society in general. Also, this belief that social justice really is a core Islamic principle. I mean, the one that I always love to read from the Quran, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, people, we created you all from a single man and a single woman and made you into races and tribes so that you could come to know one another. And that's the 49th surah. If Imam Rabbani is probably on here somewhere, and he'll, tell me the real translation of that "come to know," but just that phrase, it's not respect. It's not this, well, I'm going to learn something about you and then whatever. It's really like, I'm going to listen to you and I'm going to find out what you're all about. And coming to know is also a process. This isn't something you're going to figure out right away. It's like I had somebody that told me where they always say, well, I want to be able to walk in other people's steps or other people's shoes. No, you can't walk in other people's shoes. Now you can walk alongside them and listen to them and try to understand their story and understand how that relates to you, or maybe how they want you to understand them. But no, you can't. And it's just like with me, I have no idea what the experience was like living as a Black man or woman in Mississippi. But I can sit there and learn and listen and be part of it that way. And I think this quote, and there's a number of other ones I'm not going to go through now, that really talk about how this recognizing each other, and it comes down to what the Imam said about recognizing that dignity in every person. It's the person, it's humans. You're not here. The reason that you're in tribes is also there's some differences and you can get to know each other. But that has all been distorted. And you could say Shaitan has certainly made a lot of hay out of making that all of us in our own little tribes. So as I would go through, like even the from Bukhari, one of the hadith where the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, well, how do you help your brother, whether he is an oppressor or is oppressed? Well, and they were like, well, wait a minute, if it's all right to help him as oppressed, what do we do if he's the oppressor? Prevent him from oppressing others. So as you'll see, as I go through my book, it's not only that fighting for social justice or a belief in social justice is a core part of being a Muslim. I believe as Muslims, we're also called upon to take action. We're called upon to do something. We're called upon to forbid evil. We're called upon to stop a brother or a sister who's oppressing other people, or somebody who isn't a brother or sister. There's also this concept of nasiha, which is, there's some hadith about this where you offer correction, good advice. Somebody is particularly to leaders, somebody who is a leader and they're not following what they're supposed to be doing. Well, that's also a call for action that we have to take up. So that's where, when I read, and I'll mention this a little bit, that in all those books I was talking about the Nation of Islam, this whole idea of the Nation of Islam, and I think it's really been extended to the Imam W. Muhammad community in a lot of people's minds. That's not a religion. That's something to do with Black nationalism, and it's really not a religious expression. And I was even surprised that Well, one example is, I think everybody knows who Sherman Jackson is. So I read his book, and Dr. Eldine has written some pretty terrific books where they both talk about how important the historical context is for when Islam, grows among a people or among a country. And there's a Talal Assad is also a Muslim sociologist or anthropologist more, and they all talk about, you have to look at what the historical circumstances are when this group became Muslims. It became a Muslim community. Well, I think about what was going on in the Nation of Islam in the 30s and 40s and so on. And you had Jim Crow America. I mean, you can't ignore that. That's what the Nation of Islam grew out of. And the one thing that, and I like Sherman Jackson, but I was just really surprised. This is in his book, Islam and the Black American. He argues, this is at the end, the secular interests of subverting white supremacy, he's talking about the Nation of Islam, are a major preoccupation of Black American Muslims. And this is one of the reasons he recommends Sufism, which I found very odd, to avoid the trap of secularization. Well, if you really read into what he's saying, okay, Sufism is spirituality, that's kind of a connection there. But fighting for social justice is secularizing? Subverting white supremacy is a secular activity? No, I don't think so. And in my mind, it's a central part, a core part of what it is to be a Muslim. So if you're thinking that, well, the Nation of Islam, well, they're Black nationalists and, they're doing all, they want a land of their own and all this kind of stuff. Well, in my view, the way it's defined here, and I think the way our faith and our deen defines it, that's religious activity. That's fighting for social justice. That's living, that's like raising a people up and giving them dignity. I mean, how is that not the case? So I'm not going to go through some of the other assumptions because I want to leave some time for questions, and we'll talk about a couple of these later, particularly like how racism combined with Islamophobia after 9/11, and this conflict between the immigrant Muslims that came over here in 1965 as the kind of experts of speaking for Islam, and they rejected a lot of Black culture and Black American culture, which had to do with why they didn't think you all or whatever were true Muslims. But we'll go over that later. But I do want to stop because I want to make sure we got full time for questions.
Okay, I like your kind of summary and bringing that together. The nasiha and the correction, offering this correction of action. So we are going to open the floor for questions and comments from our audience.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Brother Bill, thank you very much for your presentation. I don't want to take for granted that this is your journey to Al-Islam has been easy, given your background as a person of the Caucasian persuasion in the Catholic Church, and how that has grown you and shaped you in a lot of ways. And I also don't want to take for granted the significant contribution you're making to our community, the community of Imam W.D. Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him. And I want to say that. I want to say that up front. I'm really grateful for it. And when the history is written, it is my belief that we'll look back at your contribution as very significant, given that that the Imam opened our community up to people of non-African Americans a long time ago.
Yeah.
And your journey to Al-Islam is one of those things that I will always treasure and remember. So thank you for this contribution. And as you get further into your discussion, and by the way, I've been reading your book with great interest. And so thank you again, and we'll talk further as you move toward your second presentation. I'm much appreciative of what you're doing.
Appreciate that, Brother Ron.
Thank you very much. I think Brother Clyde has his hand up.
Yes, I do. And I am really conflicted because there's so many things I want to say here.
You conflicted? How's that possible?
I'm conflicted at where to start, brother. Let me just quickly say it, maybe in 10 seconds. Every time I listen to you talk, I realize how close our lives have been to each other. I keep forgetting about your Detroit upbringing. I keep thinking, well, he went to Northwest, he's Chicago. Well, I went to high school in Detroit too. And I know about the Jesuits, Interestingly, you and I believe the University of Detroit High School Jesuit, right?
That's right.
Yeah, you and our Attorney General in Minnesota went to that high school.
That's right. Yeah. One of our more esteemed graduates.
Yes, yes. Well, the other thing, you made me think about some things that kind of came to some coincided. I don't like the term coincidence, but they coincided. You were talking about Parr. I had completely forgotten about Parr. But it's interesting that Parr started the things that were happening at the same time. For example, the assassination of Martin Luther King in 68. And you talked about Parr taking off in 68, 69. That was the impetus for a number of things, maybe for lack of a better word, going to another level in terms of dealing with racism. And there was a strong presence of Parr, in Ann Arbor. And the white allies part that you discussed too, I found that very, very satisfying to hear a person who is quote unquote, and I hate these terms because all these terms are made up. There was no white people in America before 1790 because we didn't even have the word. So
that's right.
It was created to justify what they wanted to do. But to have someone who is labeled white talk about Parr and the alliances that existed. But the interesting thing, though, the reluctance toward al-Islam existed on the white side and the black side of that, because we had the socialist movements on the black side. There were a number of them. Drum, there was another group out of Detroit, and there were those of us who obviously were leaning toward the Nation of Islam, and they thought that meant, and this gets to Sherman Jackson, that meant that we didn't know anything about the so-called legitimate Islamic scholars. Where in fact, many of us, particularly that were students that were interested in the Nation of Islam, we were reading the books written by Ghazali and and the Islamic scholars, and we still decided, I don't see anything happening there that removes the need for something. So some of the things that the Nation of Islam is advancing, but we continue to grow, and eventually our community grew. There were lots of individuals in the community that were growing in their understanding and their hunger and their readiness for al-Islam, obviously coming to us in the way that it addressed our needs, our history, and everything. That happened. Imam Waradin Muhammad came, and that obviously helped. He was it. But I think it's important to note that there was hunger in our community for that and readiness for that when it came. It wasn't something that was forced upon us or you had to twist our arms, etc. The door was wide open for anybody to leave. And since about 95% of the people didn't, obviously it was something that it was a time for. So we had a lot of allies from Parr and other places when Martin Luther King when he was killed, and that really kind of took things to the next level. I'll close out with the Sherman Jackson reference. I think there is some of the apologetics that some of us developed to distance ourselves because we accepted the idea and the extent of the idea of the quote unquote illegitimacy of the Nation of Islam and its value. And when I met Sherman Jackson, he was at University of Michigan. He had a dual appointment in the Center for African American African Studies and in the Center for Near Eastern Studies, which at that time was really what we would call Islamic studies, or Middle Eastern studies today. And I had a conversation with him about how the Center for African American Studies came about. It was definitely a very political movement. It was also multiracial. Most didn't realize it, but it had a lot of influence of the Nation of Islam behind it. And to the point that I tell some people are tired of hearing me say this. When the African American Studies program was introduced to the University of Michigan, Muhammad Speaks was required reading every week in the course, the survey course, which obviously had more white people in it than black people. That weren't enough of us to go around to be the majority at the time.
Well, and again, that's part of the history that's been redacted.
Exactly.
People didn't want to hear about that.
Exactly.
And even things like, hopefully most people know this now, but Imam Nabi Muhammad was one of the founders of the American Islamic College.
Exactly.
In the 80s. And
right.
The reason he was involved was because, and this is something Zarina Rawal and Dr. Aldine cover in their books, he was tired of people saying, well, to get to true education on Islam, you got to go to Egypt, you got to go to Saudi Arabia, you got to go to Syria. He started the college and no, you don't have to go to those places. We have Muslim scholars here in America, and we can read, Al-Ghazali, and we can read all those books too, and we have that. So that was the reason he started AIC.
Well, let me give you a little bit of a nuance on that. I was on the committee that Imam Warthi Muhammad set up to get the state of Illinois to authorize us to open a college. The original name of the original idea was it was going to be the American Muslim Teachers College to prepare teachers to educate our students. We got approval of that from the application, which is one of the biggest projects I've ever worked on in my life. Not only did we get approved, they said it was probably the best application they had ever received in the state of Illinois' history and later on, there was money supposed to come to him for that. That money never came to him. Later on, someone came up with the idea that I don't know where it came from, but all of a sudden there was going to be another college. It was going to be on the north side of Chicago. And it was going to be the AIC, not the American Muslim Teachers College. They got the kind of money that was promised to Imam Warthi Muhammad. And I'm telling you what I witnessed. I was present.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Imam still kept our application, and we attempted to take it to North Carolina when we got this property in Sedalia. That was a boarding school that had been run by Charlotte Hawkins Brown, great Black educator, who was a relative of Natalie Cole. I think she was an aunt, a great aunt. And I don't remember exactly what happened to that. But the truth is, it was actually not an application for the American Muslim Teachers College. They came along later. And then they had lost the accreditation, and then they had to come back online. And I know that because I helped them when they came back online to get things reestablished.
Well, that's been quite a history. I'm wondering if someone else might have a question. I love talking to you, Brother Clyde.
Imam Tariq had his hand up, but he may have just left.
You left a note in the chat.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Imam Tariq, he sends his salams, but he did have his hand up. So hopefully he will be able to bring it back next week. So this was wonderful. Thank you so very much. Yes, good commentary.
So then, can I just ask one question?
Absolutely,
Yes.
Imam Rabbani.
Thank you, Brother Bill. Sure appreciate you. You know that. But I remember. I think your dissertation was to be how many pages?
Oh, that you're talking about my master's thesis.
Your master's thesis.
Yeah, all we had to do was write 50 pages.
And how many? How many did you?
It ended up at being 150, and that was obviously before I updated it. with all this new information. So, you know, it's
So
a topic that's hard
so
not
do we
to
have all
talk about.
150 pages between these two covers, or is there more to come?
No, this is it. unless I write a you know, volume 2 or something. But yeah, I don't know if I'll be doing that. But
Yeah.
Well, this is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Imam Rafani. We also have a thank you from Anne to Brother Bill for your presentation. So we are actually at our conclusion mark, our 2 o'clock mark. So we look forward to you being back next week, Brother Bill, and delivering part 2. And so everyone come prepared with all of your questions. And this was great. Thank you so very much.
And maybe I should do a quick, it's not really a commercial because it's the money is going to go to Majid Otakwa, but probably saw the note in the beginning that basically anybody who buys my book between like today and next Sunday, it's like $20 for the hardcover. I'm going to donate all the money to the renovation campaign that's going on in Majid Otakwa. So see, you have another good reason to buy the book.
Yes. Thank you. I was going to mention that, so I'm glad you did. Thank you very much. And so I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I encourage you to also subscribe to the Masjid Otakwa's YouTube channel as well. And we will see everyone next week, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yes. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you all for being a part. We bid you all peace and blessings and well wishes. Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody.